Throughout my years of wandering across the globe, I've encountered countless people walking the same path, each with their own story, dreams, and struggles. Among the many kinds of travelers I've met, there's a particular group that stands out: the budget travelers. Some had enough savings to stretch their journeys by cutting costs wherever possible. Others managed a small recurring income that sustained them while they wandered. And then, there were those like the protagonist of this story, people who had elevated budget travel to an entirely new level, traveling without any money. This is the story of Marco, a man I met during one of my stays in Norway. Marco, a young man from the Italian region of Calabria, had left his home with nothing but a small backpack and a determination to see the world. He didn't have money, but that didn't seem to bother him. What he had was something more valuable: a fearlessness that defied common sense and a commitment to living life on his own terms. It was midsummer in an ancient forest just outside the city of Oslo. My two friends and I had set up a small camp in the woods near the outskirts of the city. What began as a humble gathering quickly grew into a small village of sorts, thanks to the rave parties we hosted on weekends. Soon enough, this forest-hippie community became a hub for people passing through, many of them, like Marco, drawn by the need for free accommodation in the otherwise notoriously expensive Norwegian capital. One evening, after returning from the city, I was introduced to Marco. He had arrived at the camp while I was out and was now sitting quietly near the communal fire. He was hard to miss, with his curly hair peeking out from under a worn-out bowler hat, and his pants violet and checkered, were at least 2 sizes too small. His appearance was comical, but there was a calm and peaceful air about him. He didn't say much at first, but something about his quiet nature drew me to him. As we got to talking over the next few days, Marco slowly opened up about his journey. He had been on the road for a few months by the time we met, hitchhiking his way across Europe, with no particular destination in mind. He told me he had left his small town in Calabria with little more than the clothes on his back and a handful of coins. He didn't have any grand mission driving him, just a deep desire to see the world beyond his quiet, uneventful life back home. I didn't pry too much into his past, but from what he shared, I could sense that something had pushed him to leave, perhaps a feeling of being stuck, a need for adventure, or even a broken heart. Whatever the reason, it was clear that Marco was searching for something, even if he didn't yet know what that was. During his stay with us, he explained his method of surviving without money. He'd hitch rides wherever he could, never knowing where he might end up, and he spent his nights sleeping in parks, fields, or forests. Sometimes, when he was in a city, he'd find an empty squat to stay in or camp out in public parks. But his real talent, according to him, was acquiring food. Marco had become something of an expert in what he called supermarket donations. It wasn't really donations. Of course it was shoplifting. He had no qualms about it, either. You just walk in, grab what you need, and walk out, he explained with a grin. No need for any fancy tricks, just act like you belong there. His method was simple but effective. Marco took only what he needed to get by: bread, fruit, a few vegetables, maybe some canned goods. He wasn't greedy, just resourceful. And since he didn't drink or smoke, his expenses were almost non-existent. In a way, he had achieved something many dream of but few dare to pursue: a life free from the constraints of money. Still, Marco wasn't completely without a way to earn some cash. He liked to call himself a juggler, but after seeing him perform one day in the city, I would hesitate to call it juggling. He had 3 juggling balls that he clumsily tossed between his hands, often dropping them. But his real act wasn't the juggling, it was his boldness in asking passers-by for money. He'd pick out random people from the crowd, often calling them out directly. "Hey, you in the blue jacket, you've got some coins for me, right? Don't be shy." His approach was so direct and unapologetic that people often found themselves handing over small donations, either out of amusement or shock. Despite his carefree attitude, Marco did have a softer side. One afternoon, As we sat in a sunny meadow near the camp, he told me about a girl he had met while traveling through Germany. Her name was Eva, and he spoke about her with a wistful smile. They had spent a few weeks together, wandering through the countryside and enjoying each other's company. But, as with many fleeting travel romances, it eventually came to an end. Eva had returned to her studies, and Marco had continued his journey alone. Though he tried to act like it didn't bother him, I could see the sadness in his eyes when he spoke about her. For the rest of his stay, Marco didn't talk much about where he planned to go next. He seemed content to linger in the camp, enjoying the laid-back lifestyle we had created there. But eventually, like all travelers, he grew restless again. One morning, a group of Czech travelers arrived at our camp. They were on their way to a music festival in the Netherlands and had stopped by on their journey to rest and meet fellow wanderers. Marco had never met these guys before, but within 15 minutes of their arrival, he had made up his mind. He was going with them. With a quick goodbye and a wave, he packed up his meager belongings and set off once more, heading toward another unknown destination. That was the last time I saw or heard from Marco. Sometimes, when I'm sitting around a campfire in a new city or wandering through a distant country, I wonder where he is now. I hope that wherever he is, he's found what he was looking for. Perhaps he's still out there, hitchhiking his way through Europe. Or maybe he's settled down somewhere, content with the life he's carved out for himself. Either way, I hope he's happy. Marco's story, like the stories of many travelers, is a reminder that the road can take us to places we never expected both physically and emotionally. It's not always about the destination sometimes, it's about the journey and the people we meet along the way. As Marco and the group of Czech travelers disappeared into the distance, the camp felt quieter without him. His presence, though quiet and unassuming, had left an impression on all of us. We had shared stories, laughter, and countless meals by the fire, bonding in the way only nomads could through fleeting but intense companionship. Each of us, in our own way, had grown fond of Marco's peculiar way of living, and now, as he ventured off to another festival, his absence created a void, a reminder of the impermanence that comes with a life on the road. But Marco's spirit lingered, not just in the memories we held of him, but also in the way he inspired some of us. His carefree approach to life, his ability to survive with almost nothing, and his lack of attachment to material possessions left us thinking. While many of us had been cutting corners to extend our travels, Marco had thrown out the idea of cutting corners altogether. He had simply eliminated the need for corners. He lived as if the world were his home, a place where food, shelter, and experiences were free if you just had the courage to take them. After he left, I found myself reflecting on the stories he'd told, especially one from his early days of travel. Marco had mentioned a moment when he was deep in southern France, completely out of food and unable to hitch a ride for days. With only a handful of coins and no prospect of a meal in sight, he found himself sitting on a bench outside a small rural bakery, watching as locals came in and out with fresh bread and pastries. His stomach growled, but he didn't panic. Instead, he waited patiently. He told me that after a few hours, the bakery owner came out and handed him a baguette without a word, as if knowing exactly what he needed. Things like that happen when you're open to them, Marco had said. The world provides for those who believe it will. It was a philosophy that, at first, seemed naive. But the more I traveled, the more I realized there was truth in it. While not everyone could live the way Marco did, some needed security, stability, and a semblance of a plan. There was something liberating about the idea of trusting the universe to guide you, of letting go of the rigid structures society imposed and simply being. A few days after Marco left, the camp saw new visitors. As always, the flow of people was constant. Some stayed for a night, others for weeks, but Marco's story began to spread through the campfire conversations. Travelers were curious about the Italian who had survived without a penny, and soon Marco became somewhat of a legend in our little forest village. People would ask, "Did you meet Marco? The guy who travels with nothing." And we'd nod, sharing our own recollections of his time with us. His departure also led to discussions about the nature of travel itself. We talked about what it meant to truly let go, to not be weighed down by the traditional concerns of money, plans, or even purpose. While Marco had lived at the extreme end of the spectrum, his presence made us all question our own reasons for being on the road. Some of us were escaping, others searching. A few were just drifting. But in the end, we were all drawn to this nomadic life for the same reason: freedom. Freedom from societal expectations, from the 9-to-5 grind, and from the belief that life had to follow a predetermined path. The camp, which had once been merely a place for temporary rest, started to feel like more than that. It became a space for reflection, a sanctuary where travelers could pause, reassess, and share their own stories. Inspired by Marco, some people began to experiment with living more simply, seeing how little they could survive on, and trusting that things would work out. Some of us would try shoplifting in the same bold way Marco had, while others focused on bartering or sharing within the community, creating a system that felt more sustainable, more connected. One evening, weeks after Marco had gone, I found myself thinking about his journey once again. I wondered if he had made it to the festival, if he was still hitchhiking with the Czechs, or if he'd found another place to settle for a while. I imagined him wandering through the streets of Amsterdam, calling out to passers-by for coins in his direct, unapologetic way. Perhaps he was already onto a new adventure, hitching a ride to yet another destination, always moving, never standing still for long. What stuck with me most, though, was Marco's search for meaning. He wasn't just traveling to see new places, he was searching for something deeper, something intangible. Whether it was love, purpose, or simply a way to understand himself better, Marco was on a journey, not just across continents but within himself. And while I didn't know if he would ever find what he was looking for, I admired his courage to keep searching, even when the road ahead was uncertain. For me, Marco's story became a symbol of the essence of travel. It's not about ticking destinations off a list or accumulating experiences like trophies. It's about the connections we make, the lessons we learn, and the freedom we feel when we break away from the conventional. Marco may not have had money or even a plan, but he had something far more valuable: a heart open to the world and a willingness to embrace whatever came his way. As the days passed and the seasons began to change, the camp evolved once more. New travelers came and went, each with their own stories to tell. But Marco's legacy remained, a reminder to all of us that sometimes the most profound journeys are the ones that take us far beyond the limits of what we thought was possible. Wherever he was, I hoped Marco had found his way. And in some small way, I knew that he had left a lasting impact on my own journey, one that I would carry with me for years to come. In the weeks following Marco's departure, his influence continued to ripple through our camp. Every now and then, someone would bring up a new story about him, about his fearlessness, his ability to adapt to any situation, and his willingness to trust in the kindness of strangers. His way of life made us all rethink the boundaries we had placed on ourselves. Some of us started to travel more lightly, shedding unnecessary possessions and relying more on the generosity of others. The concept of true freedom became a frequent topic of discussion around the fire, and Marco's approach to life, his belief that the world would provide for those who trusted it, became a philosophy many of us wanted to explore for ourselves. There was something transformative about watching people let go of their anxieties about the future. Instead of obsessing over where they'd sleep next, or how they'd pay for their next meal, they began to live more in the moment, embracing the unpredictability of the road. I, too, found myself loosening my grip on plans and finances, inspired by Marco's journey. I realized that, while I may not live exactly as he did, there was a balance to be found between having a safety net and fully surrendering to the adventure. As the Norwegian summer slowly came to an end, the camp began to dwindle. The constant stream of new arrivals slowed, and those of us who remained prepared to move on to our next destinations. Yet, as I packed my own bag and prepared to set off, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the time spent in the forest, for the people I had met, and for the lessons I had learned. Though Marco was long gone, his presence stayed with me. In a way, he had become a part of my journey, just as I had become a part of his. I knew I might never see him again, but that was the nature of the road some paths cross for a moment, leaving a lasting mark, before they continue in separate directions. And in that brief intersection of lives, the world feels just a little bit smaller and more connected.